Good evening, once again. Sorry to have delayed you in this start, but welcome to Headington Baptist Church. This is very helpful for us as a church. We have many scientists who worship here. As it happens, just one of those strange quirks that we seem to have a lot of scientists here. But it's a great privilege to have Professor Andrew Steane, who's one of our members, to speak to us tonight. Andrew has spent a good time thinking through the issues of faith and science. I'm sure he'll be talking about that, and he's going to be speaking tonight with the title of his book, Faithful to Science, which is on the table at the back there, which I'm sure you'll probably mention at some point. Andrew graduated from Oxford University. He's worked mostly in fundamental physics, particularly in the areas of light and particles and quantum science. He's a fellow of Exeter College. He's in the sub-department of atomic and laser physics, and I was quite impressed when I went on the website to find he has things called Steane factors named after him, which always seems to inspire a certain amount of awe when you see somebody has factors named after them. But Andrew, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking, and I'll hand over to you. There will be opportunity for questions later. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll begin with a poem. This is a poem by me, and I will simply read it out at this stage. You don't need to read it for yourselves, because don't worry, I will read it, and then I will return to it later in the talk. Here it is. Imagine. Imagine someone told you there was a photocopier in the corridor. Now imagine someone told you there was a tiger in the corridor. Would you feel different? But nothing has changed, except that you have seen your situation differently. Imagine someone told you the floor is not the floor, but a myriad of electric pulses and knots of charged effervescence in intricate, interlinked dance. Imagine someone told you the sky is not the sky, but a boisterous tumbling of dots and commas, endlessly seeking space. Imagine your arm was a force field, your hand a nexus of inward-outward sense and shaping touch. Imagine your brain was a jungle of living fibres silently approaching and receding from each other's kiss. And suppose your life depended on weather and soil and lorry drivers and an army of humble worm-like creatures called worms. Now imagine you could not speak anything except what others can hear. Imagine you could not show anything except what others can see. Imagine you could not be anything except what others will carry. Now lightly pause and imagine being carried and carrying. Imagine being seen, heard, fed, taught, breathed, stood, awed into being. Look up, child, and tell me, what do you see? That's the end of the poem. I will return to it. Next, I will repeat my thank you for coming this evening and giving your time and attention to what I have to say. I have got a script in which I will be reading from because it helps me condense more material into the time available, but as a result, you will have to have your thinking caps on. I'm going to cover quite a lot. If in fact I've overestimated what I can cover, I'll just be aware of the time and we'll just skip on to the end later on. I think I'm talking for 45 minutes or so from now. So the idea is that after the speaking, we might, I hope, have a discussion together. Although I have prepared material that I hope will be both truthful and helpful, I think that the most good will come of this evening if I can address questions that other people are actually asking, not just ones that I have met. I will do the most good if I can help with difficulties that people actually face, not just the ones that I have thought of. For example, people mostly do not face grand questions such as the meaning of the whole universe, or indeed, they often don't face the question whether there is life after death. What they face is questions such as how much time they should give to their aging mother, or how to manage computer use at home with their children, or whether they should resist government policy on healthcare or refugees, and how to live with grief, and so on. We can help each other with all these problems by meeting with each other and fully seeing and hearing one another. The main purpose of my talk this evening is to say that this process of hearing and helping one another will go better if we bring to it a combination of science and faith in the deepest truth of things. That deepest truth of things is like a parent who affirms us and also calls us to grow. So we say, Our Father, or Living God. But I want to be careful here. The word God is very widely misused. It does not mean a supernatural entity sitting in some lofty heaven space or some distant dimension far off from the concerns of the world. It does not mean a mysterious being who mostly does nothing at all, but to whom we post off prayers like missiles thrown into the void and then wait for signs of a response. No, it does not mean anything like that. By God, this evening, and I hope whenever I use the word, I mean the reality that Jesus showed and described. And this means the loving reality that is at work in the world, in the here and now, ceaselessly finding ways to bring meaning and integrity and finally joy out of situations that would otherwise be meaningless and hopeless. So I will come now to the area commonly called science and faith, or sometimes science and religion. My aim in the next little while is twofold. First, I want to share what truth I have to offer. And secondly, I want to say why it matters. I want to say why it might genuinely make a difference in your life and in mine. First then, what truth I have to offer. I have decided to limit myself today to the following areas. First, I'll talk about an honest question about simplicity and probability. Then I will discuss basic ideas about what science is and what faith is. I'll then talk a bit about Darwinian evolution and human origins. We'll have a bit about the origin of the universe. And then perhaps more importantly, the last two areas, the sense in which science cannot and never will offer the whole truth, and the way in which science is liberated for service when placed in the context of faith. So first, what I call the honest question. So this is a question, isn't naturalistic philosophy just simpler? Let me expand on that a little. This is something that puzzles many scientists when faced with someone like myself who acknowledges God. They will say essentially, why not just accept that there is a physical world which we can see and touch, and it works in terms of abstract mechanisms called the laws of nature, and we are part of it, and that's all. No need for any supernatural talk. Isn't this picture just simpler, really? More rational and overwhelmingly more probable at the end of the day? This is the point made by the philosopher David Hume in the 18th century and emphasised more recently by the biologist Richard Dawkins. They might add the following thought, which is a very widely held, sort of either well thought through or just wondered about thought. The following. In the past, people appealed to God because the world was mysterious, but science has slowly but surely swept all that away, and now there is no reason to think that a supernatural agency will ever be needed to explain any phenomenon. I call this an honest question, and let me admit that it is not easy to answer. This is not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer is subtle. First, let's just think about the following. Let me just, I'll click that in a moment. First, the following. It is true that the rise of science has enabled us to get rid of many superstitious ways of thinking. And insofar as religion has got mixed up with superstition, this has helped to correct it, and this is a good thing. Good religious faith has always been opposed to superstition, so we genuinely welcome this. A lot of people think that consequently science has gradually eroded all the reasons for faith. In fact, this is not the case. The deeper truths that faith affirms are not opposed by science, and in fact they act to nurture science, and this is what I will be talking about today. So I'm coming to that, just for now giving you the general sense of how we deal with a question like this. What science does correct is the mistakes that it can detect. But today I will be talking about the following. I will be talking about the idea that our life should be lived as a response springing out of gratitude, involving a determination to join in with making the world better, and an admission that we need help to change. Science has not eroded this. I will also be talking about the fact that people are most deeply liberated and enabled to grow when they receive a sort of seed of an idea. This seed is the idea that ultimately reality is all about love, a love that exceeds what the universe can contain. And this love meets with us on the basis of free gift, not rewards. And this love treats us on the basis of realism and forgiveness, not putting on a good face. Has science gradually eroded this beautiful seed of an idea? Well, no, actually, it has not. Science has not eroded this one iota. But the philosopher in all of us will still be puzzled. Haven't I just described some sort of wishful thinking? Isn't the atheist version more reasonable and rational? Now let me say, this is somewhat like the question, how do we know that another human being, like my friend John over here, is a person whom we might meet and know, not just a complicated physical object that we can use? So this is the nature of the question we're dealing with now. How do we know that a physical object like John there is in fact not just a physical object, but a person that we might meet and know? This is the sort of question which Hume and David Hume and Richard Dawkins are raising without perhaps realising that they are. What is going on in the question that they raise is an attempt to put God to use. They want to put him to use as a scientific explanation. But the answer is simply that this is not the right way to approach God. God is not there to offer explanations. He is not a hypothesis which we invoke like a servant. The relationship simply doesn't work that way. God is not a part of science, but the provider of science. What he offers is not a simplification of some scientific scheme, but the very idea that things can make sense. He offers, as I've put it there, not so much one explanation or another, so much as the very concept of explanation. You may have seen a joke, I haven't got the picture for this, but there's probably mathematician or physicist writing lengthy equations and mathematical formulae on a blackboard, and then he makes the comment, oh yes, and here a miracle happens, and then he carries on. And that's of course how a lot of people think about God. They think there, he just comes in there, he sort of interrupts the flow, does that bit. But no, where's God? No, God's in the fact that the whole thing makes sense. That's what we're sort of receiving when we receive the notion that maybe God is love. Now, of course, you don't buy into a notion as big as that all in one go. You sort of look in on it from various directions, and then you begin to try it out a little bit. So the talk will be doing that. So what God offers then is the very idea that things can make sense. What he offers is simply and directly love. And the reason why we acknowledge God is simply and directly pure truthfulness, without hoping to gain anything by it, not even an answer to questions about the origin of life or the universe. You see, we are not out to use God, we just want to form a partnership with him. What most of us find, and now I guess I'm speaking from a more personal point of view, is that as we come to trust Jesus, the faithful picture, which I've been illustrating, begins to make more and more sense, and the question posed by Richard Dawkins sort of evaporates. it becomes more and more like the question, why did the chicken cross the concerto? But the chicken did not cross the concerto because that doesn't make any sense. A concerto is a piece of music, not something that a chicken could cross. In a similar way, the question, what argument is there for the God hypothesis, does not make any sense, because a hypothesis is not the sort of thing that God is or could ever be. I realise that this sounds like a paradox. That is right. A paradox is what happens when something does not seem to make sense, not because it is false, but because you are unaware of some hidden assumption that has caused you to misunderstand it. So, as I've already alluded, I can't guarantee to make this clear all in one go. I'm just hoping you'll stay with me and see whether the talk is helpful. I will do my best to be clear. So, I haven't said that on that. Okay, my final point on this. The other reason why we acknowledge God, and I will say more about this later, is that we think that by doing that we will interpret what is going on in the world correctly. And I will say more about that. Now, I've now come to this sort of basic thought of what is science, and then after that, so what is faith? So first of all, what is science? Here are some foundational ideas. Science is essentially a way of finding things out about the physical universe and how it all fits together. The foundational idea in science is that the universe is not some sort of hodgepodge that does not make any sense. Rather, it is shot through, the universe this is shot through with marvellous patterns at every scale, and we can hope to uncover and understand those patterns. In science, we do not do this understanding just by abstract thought alone, but by a combination of thought and experiment, checking out our ideas one step at a time by careful empirical test. So to summarise, the world is highly structured, not arbitrary, and that structure should be discovered by rational argument and empirical test with efforts to check for mistakes. I mean, that's the essential business of science. Now, these foundational ideas were not always known in the human race. They were hinted at in ancient Greece, but much more fully discovered in 17th century Europe. And there is interesting and historical and philosophical evidence that these foundational ideas of science were greatly promoted by Christian thinking based on what had been learned from the ancient Hebrews as well as the ancient Greeks. Science came into its own when people recognized two things about the universe. First, people recognized that the universe is the created product of a single rational source. And secondly, people recognized that the universe is cared about and declared to be good in the sense of intrinsically valuable and suited to its function. So the first of these ideas, you see, the idea of creation by God, suggested that the physical world could somehow make sense and be understood. And the second idea, that physical nature is good and shouldn't be disdained or feared. And I have to say, often in the sort of attempts by human beings to get a sense of what life is all about, they've thought that we should sort of distance ourselves from mere physicality and sort of launch ourselves off into another realm, a sort of a spiritual realm. But the Christian Jewish tradition says, no, that's not quite the right way to think of it. The physical world is good and suited to what it is for. It's not the only good or the whole good, but it should be welcomed, not feared or disdained. And of course, this is a tremendously highly motivating thought to the development of science. It suggests that scientific investigation is valuable in and of itself, like an art. And that is why scientists do science. They do it for the sheer love of it, not because it has technological impact, although of course it does that as well. Scientists are in it for the love of it. So these two ideas strongly motivated and promoted science. So the main idea I'm making, the point I'm making just now, is that science took off in a cultural setting where faith in God came first and science followed from it. This is illustrated by the example followers of God, whom I've shown here. These are Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell, who to a physicist is one of the really great names. I know he's not so widely known in general culture, but he's certainly the equal of someone like Newton. Also William Thomson or Lord Kelvin, who made great contributions to thermodynamics and other areas of science. And I mentioned also Arthur Eddington. And I could, of course, mention more, including people still alive. But I've chosen to let them choose how they want to present themselves rather than me sort of speaking for them. So these people are all top-class scientists. They illustrate that the fact that faith can exist in intimate relation with the very best scientific gifts and accomplishment. Now, I'm not going to say very much about the history of science and religion just today, but I would like to correct one false impression that you often hear. This is the idea that historically Christian churches, and especially clergy, have been mostly opposed to science and held it back. Well, this is simple. In fact, that is the opposite of the truth, and I really just honestly invite you to go and find this out for yourself if you can spare the time. But let me tell you what you'll find. During 400 years since the 17th century, of course, there have been occasions where clergy or other spokespeople for the Christian community have opposed some scientific idea and then been proved wrong. There have been such occasions. However, some of those debates were, in any case, the kind of debate that science naturally involves as it makes progress. And more importantly, for by far the greater proportion of the time, Christian churches have encouraged and nurtured the practice and development of science. They were, in fact, the major nurturer of science for a very long period. The idea that science and religion have been mostly at loggerheads is a cultural myth. It has, as I say, been rejected by mainstream study of the history of science. In fact, Christian churches promoted the growth of universities and gave people time and money to pursue research into all areas of learning. Why did they do that? Why did Christian churches think that that was a good way to behave, to promote the growth of universities and so on? Well, here's an exchange recorded between Jesus of Nazareth and a person of his time trained in the ancient Hebrew scriptures. So, such a person, a lawyer, asked him a question to assess him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So he's sort of saying, well, the substance of what we've learned from our Hebrew and Jewish inheritance is love to God with all your heart, soul and mind, and love to neighbour. Now, the emphasis in bold was just added by me to help you draw your attention to the bit I want to mention. The Bible doesn't have bold emphasis. It's for us to sort of think about what's written there. But the point is, when people later ask themselves what loving God with all your mind might involve, they naturally came to see it as including all sorts of scholarly work in all areas of study. Now, Jesus also talked about a vision for life in general. He showed us what it is like when our truest parent is at work. Now, and it is not like diktats and commands passed down from on high. It is like the way Jesus himself lived. It involves ideas like seeds springing to life and much reassurance that we are cared about, so that we in return have creative attitudes, behaving like tasty salt and welcome light to keep life from going bad. This is what is going on in the best parts of our lives, and it is what should be going on in the world in general. Jesus called it the kingdom of God. This was his way of showing us what human life is like when the true Father is at work. Science is very much part of this. It is an important part of how we can live like children of God and join in with his project of creating a fair and supportive community. Such a community will also learn to wisely manage the ecosystem of life on Earth more generally. So I will say more about science, but next I will talk about faith. I've already given some hints as to what faith involves, but now I should point out some very simple things. First, the word faith does not mean believing something without a reasonable basis in evidence. It simply does not mean that. That is not at all what faith means. We already have in our English language perfectly good words that do mean belief without reason. That is called either delusion or guesswork. But faith is not about delusion and guesswork. Faith is basically about trust, honesty, and a sense of value. I repeat, it is not and never has been about belief without evidence. Now, let me show you this by some examples. We exercise one type of faith. This is just faith in ordinary human situations, and I'll expand it to religious faith in a moment. We exercise a type of faith all the time as we go about our daily lives. We go to the shops and buy things, and we assume that although the shopkeeper is no pushover, they are basically doing a reasonable deal with us. We trust them. We have some faith in them. So these two gentlemen, the one buying the article, is willing to believe that the item handed over to him is pretty much what he thinks it is. He won't discover when he opens it at home that it's empty or poisonous or anything else that it's all not to be. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper is willing to trust that this chap buying something off of him is a reasonably trustworthy sort of a human being. He can't know for sure that the other gentleman hasn't just quietly slipped a chocolate bar into his pocket while he wasn't looking. Nor can the chap buying it, be sure of what he's trusting the shopkeeper. So why are they doing this? They're trusting each other more than they know for sure. Okay, and I'm just pointing out we do this all the time. Similarly, as we walk home, we don't need a bulletproof jacket or a guard dog. We assume the other people around about are basically not out to get us or steal the things we just bought in the shops. This sort of trust is absolutely central to life. We simply could not function without it. It is, of course, built on some foundation of evidence, but we commonly trust one another well beyond the degree to which it could be proved. Thus, we risk being tricked or hurt all the time, but nevertheless, this is the best way to live. Why are we so trusting? Well, these two gentlemen could mistrust each other. One could suspect that the other is basically not buying things but trying to rob him. But he chooses not to do that because he knows he sort of hopes it's not that. He chooses to trust the more valuable thing. He wants to think the situation to be as good as he thinks it could be. He's reasonable to go there. He's willing to go there. He prefers going there than going to the bad situation, which it could also be. Okay, this is what faith is about. So we choose to be trusting partly because of our sense of value. We value goodness and we're on the lookout for it. We want it. We champion it. So we are willing to go out on a limb for it. We want to take the risk of assuming someone is better than we know for sure. We often choose to do that rather than be completely neutral because it gives us a chance to be alive, to venture out and connect with people. It is not that there is no evidence, but we see some evidence and go further. That is what faith is about. For centuries, most people knew roughly what we mean by faith, and together with hope and love, it was felt to be one of the great treasures of human life. But two types of movement have distorted the word. Some Christian churches have become corrupt at one time or another, or maybe they just made stuff up and called it faith. Other people constructed delusional belief systems, such as Scientology or astrology, and lazily justified this by calling it faith. Then, seeing all that and reacting, other people rejected all those delusions, and they also decided that maybe this was what faith is all about after all, so they rejected faith too. So you see, both types of people's group have redefined faith as unmotivated belief. Belief without any reasonable evidence, but that's just a redefinition. In fact, the word faith means what it always means, or should mean what it always meant. And I will now be today using it under its original and true meaning, and to help you with it, I've summarized it in 3 phrases. So I would say faith is WPC, right? So W for willingness, P for prompted, C for continued. Faith is willingness to venture in the direction sensed to be true and good, prompted by suggestive, though incomplete evidence, and continued through a growing sense of recognition. Religious faith, or faith in God, is the type of faith which takes this attitude toward the very foundation of our universe and of our inner life. It says that this foundation is not just random or unknowable or even neutral, but ordered and knowable and committed. Please note, we have some reasonable evidence for this. We don't say it is proven, but it is reasonable to believe it. Now I can discuss how such faith relates to science. Before I do that, I'll do that. I'll just pause a moment. Everyone happy? You with me? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay. So, this is how some people see the relationship between faith and science. They more or less sort of see them as alternatives. Faith on the one hand, science on the other. There's just sort of different ways of thinking. This is wrong. Okay, get rid of that. This is the truth of it. For those for whom there is such a thing, and I'm now talking about religious faith, this is how it works. This is where it fits. It's an attitude or a basis for bringing together all of life. Science and the arts sit within this. And I want to emphasize that science is not some sort of awkward hanger-on to a good faith. It's not some sort of afterthought or a difficulty. No, it is quite at home. This is where science can flourish, and faith can flourish with it. Faith includes, for example, a willingness to trust that our ultimate maker and caller is not out to trick us. It includes the sense that investigating the natural world and understanding its patterns is part of what we are for. And science has brought untold benefits to the human race. In our hospitals, the blind are helped to see by laser surgery. The lame are helped to walk by stem cell transplants. And the all but dead rise on a daily basis. All the original insights that led to this knowledge were obtained by thoughtful, hard-working people who were eager for and receptive to scientific understanding. Something very remarkable goes on when new scientific understanding is gained. It is a form of seeing. Nobody knows quite how this works in our brains, but the fact that it happens is an interesting clue for all of us. It is a sign of a very deep creativity in the universe. It is a hint of the partnership which Christians say God has embarked upon with the human race. No one can say, aha, this thought or that thought certainly came from God. But we can say the following. The part of human experience that I'm just describing takes the form of a quiet planting of insights that yield abundant fruit. And this is the sort of thing which Jesus talked about when he talked about the kingdom of God. In other words, this is what it is like when the true Father that he talked about is allowed to be in charge. I'd like to add, I'm not for a moment implying that Jesus only had in mind the sort of scientific understanding which I'm speaking of here, because I'm going to explain scientific understanding is not, in fact, in the end, the most important truth that we need, but it is part of what we are given. So scientific knowledge does have that form that Jesus described when he talked about the kingdom of God. But nevertheless, it's not the form of inspiration that we most deeply need. We now have a good store of scientific knowledge. What we lack is chiefly wisdom and good-heartedness. So science on its own proves to be insufficient. We absolutely need other sources of wisdom. I'll say more about that in a moment. So I'll be saying about the limits of science and how we can get other sources of wisdom. But before I go there, I'm going to talk about a couple of areas which commonly come up when people are thinking about science and faith. So these are the history of life on Earth and also the origins of the universe. Now, I'm just checking for time. Okay, I think I can fit it all in, so I don't need to. Okay, let's go. This picture just briefly illustrates the general idea of the development of life over a very long period into multiple forms, all right? So you can't see all the images. It's lots of plants and animals all related to one another. That's the thought that the image gives you. So this is about the history of life on Earth. The confusion that there is around in the world today is that many people think that the science of biological evolution is incompatible with either the Bible or with faith in God or with both. But in fact, there is no real contradiction here. Charles Darwin was largely right about the mechanism of natural selection, and the opening books of the Bible are not and never were literal accounts. In short, God has created living things through the method of allowing the world itself to be creative. A variety of people contributed to the discovery of this mechanism of evolution through natural selection and variation. And some of these people, by the way, were Christian. But the overall idea is quite fairly named after Charles Darwin because he made by far the biggest contribution to its discovery. But he didn't invent it, of course. God invented it. As I say, there is no contradiction, but there is a difficulty in that this process has involved a great deal of pain and suffering. Also, some people have presented evolution in a misleading way, as if it is some sort of merciless fight for supremacy, or as if somehow it belongs to atheism. It isn't, and it doesn't. It isn't a sort of merciless fight for supremacy, nor does it belong to atheism, nor to theism, I would say. We can all make of it what we can. So in order to show that it's actually, in order to try to get a sense of what biological evolution is all about, what we need to do is simply to be patient, honest, and persevering. We must keep providing high-quality scholarship and mainstream science with whatever perspective we think is true, including the perspective of faith in God. And if we have that perspective, then what we need to do is show how theism can respond to the evolutionary story of life on Earth. The major difficulty, as I said, is that this story is full of pain and death, but it is also full of joy and life. For every death that there has ever been, there has also been a life. And death is not the main thing in the end. After all, we are still here. It is what it is. We have to see it with complete honesty, but with the sense also that this is not just a meaningless sequence of events. Now I'm going to give you some pointers as to how we might do this, how we might respond to evolution by variation and natural selection. Now, first of all, evolution has not in fact proved to be a meaningless sequence of events, because as a matter of fact, it has led to the realization of richer and deeper ways of being alive in community. That's my first point. And here's an illustration. The ants in an anthill form some sort of community, but each individual ant has a very limited sense in which it is a being. It's some sort of a being, but it's a rather limited one. Go to a community of gorillas, you have a much richer sense of beings living together in community. And of course, when it comes to human beings, vastly richer. So that's my first point. Also, this is not a story of gradual growth in aggression, but quite the contrary. It has produced communities of animals showing greater and greater awareness of and responsiveness to each other and the interests of others. That's my first couple of points. Now the third one, the eager gene. Genes have often been described as selfish, but they are not. They are, of course, as molecules, so I'm only talking about metaphors now. But a better metaphor for the way genes influence things is the metaphor of eagerness. Imagine, if you will, a bunch of young children eagerly clamoring to be chosen for a team. This is a rough picture, very rough, of the way genes influence the gene pool. They sort of all want to be next. They don't want anything at all, really. But the point is that the metaphor is better than the word selfish, because selfish is too morally loaded. It's a loaded word. Eagerness is a bit loaded, but it's not morally loaded, because eagerness is morally neutral. And that makes it a better description for inanimate molecules. Now let's come to randomness. So we think that there is randomness in natural processes. I guess you could argue that you can never be absolutely sure that what you thought was random in fact followed a law you know not of. I admit that. But let's for a moment suppose that there is such a thing as randomness. I would say you don't necessarily have to read that as a defect or a problem. After all, it could also be named openness. Randomness is the idea that what happens next is not altogether controlled or fully determined by what went before. Now that is openness, that is freedom from micromanagement. It's an important source of freedom, but of course what comes with it is all the attendant risks. But now let's look at the thought that randomness can't be the whole story. I've given you a couple of pictures of some living things there, some whatever sorts of animals they are. I'm not sure what those are called. But next door is a rose. Okay, we're more familiar. Now the petals of that rose, it's obvious, they're not random. Why not? They show much structure. It's because of profound mathematical harmony deep in the nature of the physical world that emerges again and again in physical things. Finally, I'd like to say that biological evolution shows much signs of improvisation, making do, finding new uses for old tools. And I think many of us think now, this is a rather positive thing. It's often a story of making something wonderful despite the imperfection of the component parts. This is very much like creativity in human art and artfulness. And it's also, in fact, a sort of a law of spiritual life, how we have to learn to live. We have to sort of make do with what we've got already and make something wonderful out of it. It's also something of the character of creative love, and so of God. I could go on. I guess others have already been working at this rethink of the Darwinian process and maybe made more progress than I have. I want to say that I don't claim certainty that I've got it exactly in the right perspective. The aim is certainly not to gloss over the pain of the story or to see it through rose-tinted spectacles. But we must not impose metaphors which it won't bear. The aim is to be true to the story, to see it truthfully and help others so to see it. Of course, I'm hoping for a discussion at the end, so do return if you'd like to raise. I'm aware that not every follower of Jesus, who I welcome as a brother and sister along the path, not everyone will have sort of seen it the way I've just described, and they may want to talk further. I'm happy to do that, but that's how I see it. And I think I've got good reasons, and I can say more. But now let's think about the origin of the universe. So this picture is a nice sort of artist's impression of the development of the whole universe over time. So sort of over on the left is a sort of brightness, and then a sort of net-like thing which sort of grows from that. It's giving it a sort of a feel for the idea of a wonderful Big Bang out of the origins and then development over time. There is very good reason to think that the universe has developed from a very small and intensely hot and dense state that exploded into being about 14 billion years ago. I won't go into all the evidence. I just want to say that this is what scientific study shows, and this, or something like it, is what faith in God suggested must be the case. So this picture called Big Bang is completely compatible with the idea that God has created the universe. But what I want to do today is just realize that you may have heard some leading scientists, such as Professor Stephen Hawking, say that the universe sort of made itself, or just came into being without the need for any input from a creator. Let me explain what he's saying. So Stephen Hawking and others have done a good job in figuring out the mathematical equations which describe the way space and time relate to one another on the grand scale of the universe as a whole. So the laws which scientists such as they have discovered are like mathematical equations which describe a certain type of shape. The shape is something like a sphere, except that the sphere extends through time as well as space. You don't need all the details. You don't need to get it completely clear. All you need is this general idea that there's a mathematical formula that describes the large-scale structure of space and time. So what Stephen Hawking is saying is, if you take it as a given that this mathematical formula or law of gravity is what it is, if you just sort of say that's just the case, then it will follow that any universe described by that formula is like it is. He's saying that to understand the big picture, you don't need to appeal to a God who could care about us, or indeed care about anything else. You only need to invoke impersonal mathematical principles. You add to that just the general idea that there is something rather than nothing, and that's enough. You don't need anything else. You just acknowledge that there are these abstract principles or law of gravity, and somehow there's also such a thing as existence, and then we just leave it there. And in this way, say many people, atheism can be intellectually satisfying. Now, here's the reply that I make to this as one who is willing to faithfully say, God is love. Okay, what do I say to this? Well, first, I admit that as long as we're only looking at impersonal aspects of the world, such as the structure of space and time. So as long as we're only looking at such impersonal things, well then, I agree, I need not invoke a high-level idea such as compassion or care or loving purpose if I want to understand it. So I agree with Stephen Hawking that as long as I only want to know about gravity and space-time and things like that, then I do not have enough evidence to lead me to faith in the true Father described by Jesus. That's okay. I trust that true Father mainly because of other evidence. But I'd like to add the following. The equations which describe space-time are really a tiny part of science. The argument from Hawking just doesn't address the real issue, which is the astonishing richness of the world and the deep beauty to be found in it, as well, of course, as the painful difficulty. But by focusing attention on a tiny and impersonal part, namely the mathematics of general relativity, one can come away without encountering God in his fullness of one who can care and love. But by stepping back from this and trying to be receptive to the great richness of the whole world, by trying to see it in all its majestic glory and deep harmony and painful struggle, one does at least get a hint of God. Or perhaps what one gets is an invitation. Now we'll look again at the poem that I started with. This is the text of the poem to remind you of it. I'm not going to read it through again. I'll just talk about the sorts of things that it's talking about. It talks about the way our world is rather wonderful, and so are our bodies. All the molecules of my arm are held together by strange electromagnetic forces. My arm is a force field. My brain is an intricate network of fibers continually changing their myriad connections. And of course, we ourselves are deeply dependent both on other animals, such as earthworms, which process the soil, and on other people, such as the drivers who drive the lorries of food to the shops. And we are even more deeply dependent on each other because we need others to see and hear us so that we are not isolated and utterly lonely. When we step back and think about this and try to see it fully, we find ourselves in a rather thrilling and scary, yet strangely encouraging position. We find, I think, that what is really holding us, what is really causing us to grow, is not just the various parts of the physical world, but something else entirely, a sort of creative impulse that this whole world is an expression of. What really holds us and builds us up is our truest parent, the one spoken of by Jesus. This is one whose integrity fills the very petals of the lilies and the hairs of your head. This is one who we never see directly, but whose influence we see everywhere, once we admit that this is the right way of seeing it. This realization, or really this admission that the world is God's world, is what we have to do. We have to admit that the world is God's world. This is what the word repentance means. That word is not just about turning away from bad behavior, though it does involve that. It's more about turning towards. It is turning towards a better way of seeing what is going on and how we are meant to play our part. And I'm just wanting to say that this admission is perfectly good. And the point today, of course, is that it is not a refusal of science nor of rationality. It's rather an opening up. It is really an honest admission. Okay, so I've said quite a lot, and I'm just going to summarize what I've said so far. So far, I've talked about what we mean by God and what science is and what faith is. I've explained that a reasonable faith both welcomes and promotes science. I've also talked a little about biological evolution and the start of the universe. Finally, I've tried to help us all see that the world in the present moment is filled with an integrity and a sort of creative current that is God's integrity and creative current. But let me add that it is only when we turn to God in recognition that we could ever experience the compassionate nature of that current. You see, unless we're willing to turn in some sort of personal recognition, we'll only ever get the impersonal stuff. Until we turn and offer a little trust, a little bit of ourselves, God will remain unknown, an impersonal force one step removed. This is not because of any sneakiness or unreasonable demand for blind belief. It's simply because that is the way of things with personal relationships. That is the way of things with personal relationships. So, I will now say a bit about the limits of science. I'm looking at my watch because I have now spoken a little bit longer than I promised you, and I want to know what you'd rather. Me to say a bit more, or we've had plenty, we're happy there, let's just have a discussion. Okay, so just votes for, carry on, Andrew, we'll have a bit more. Okay, votes for, no, really, that's enough, okay, we'll have a bit more. So I'm going to talk about the limits of science. Of course, I've already hinted at the fact that maybe science can't tell us everything we want to know. But let's see what is the proper place of science in human life in a bit more detail. So I'll be looking at the following thoughts. First, science explains in full strictly nothing. Rather, it's part of a larger story. I'll explain more about that in a moment. Second, a description can be complete in its own terms and yet totally inadequate. Not all important or useful questions can be framed in scientific terms. And finally, science itself can dehumanize people if it's misused. Now, the first one. People sometimes say that science cannot explain everything. Well, they're right, but they've put it the wrong way. The situation is not that science explains a lot of things, but not some things. Rather, science does not explain anything at all on its own. Okay, you got it? Let me say it again. The situation is not that science explains a lot of things but not some things, but rather science does not explain anything at all on its own. It's because it's part of a larger story. Science can never tell us, for example, what physical stuff really is at the bottom. We say, and I'm a physicist, and I agree that molecules are made of atoms, and atoms are made of fundamental particles, and fundamental particles are excitations of quantum fields, and quantum fields are described by mathematics, but we really don't know. We have not the least clue how any of this stuff actually manages to exist. And furthermore, simply following the connections within the physical world is an activity that itself rests on certain assumptions. For example, science does not itself tell us why reason and rationality is preferable to unreason and irrationality. Science simply assumes this. Why does science assume this? Well, it's because people have some notion of what is good and what is bad. But science itself cannot tell us what is good and what is bad. Why are we even bothering to do science? Well, because we have some sense of value. And science requires that before it can even begin to make any sort of statement. So this picture shows you a sort of a bridge hanging in the void. That's what science is like on its own. It's missing an anchor at both ends. On one end is the great mystery of physical existence. Why do things exist at all? And why are they still here? Why is this object? It's there now. It's still there. And what's really giving it its existence? Science cannot tell us that. That's one of its anchor points. But at the other end, I want to emphasize is equally important or perhaps more important. The one I pointed to when I said that science has to make certain assumptions. We need some sense of why we're doing science. We need that sense of value, that the world can be better if we understand it more. It's worth understanding, and we can work to make it better. And that's what also is supporting science at the other end, some sense of value and what is good. So these are the two supports which science needs. Okay, I'm going to now carry on talk about descriptions. So this is the notion that science can itself somehow provide a complete description of the physical world. And my point is that if you describe the physical world in the terms of physics and chemistry and so on, If in the end of the day your description is in terms of the physical laws that someone like myself is trying to unpick, that's all very well. It can be a complete description, but that does not necessarily mean it's really got the right insight. And you can easily see the point. I'll just compare it to the case where someone gave you a description of the film Toy Story, and it's going to be a complete description which doesn't leave anything out. And it's completely telling you about all the electrical voltages in the computer programs that created the animation, and it will tell you the brightness of all the glowing pixels. Okay, suppose you had such a complete description of that form, which only in terms of programs, currents, glowing pixels. But it simply did not mention friendship or hope or disappointment. So that's a description which is thorough, accurate, complete in its own language, in its own terms, and yet, of course, completely misses the point. So you can have the complete descriptions which totally lack insight. So that's, of course, an easy point to see once you've had it pointed out to you. But it is amazing how often that gets ignored in high-level scientific discussions. There is this idea that once we've got everything sorted out into some sort of algorithmic model for the human brain and statistical tests, then it'll all fall into place. We'll know who we are. But that thought is complete rubbish, as I have just shown you. This Toy Story illustration shows us not only the blindness of pure science, but also something of the difference that Christian faith makes. Now, I'm not making the point that maybe there are people out there who make the mistake, in the case of human life, of only talking about the pixels. Of course they don't, and all of us know that we don't do that. We go further. Now, in the case of human life, everyone makes some sort of attempt to see the larger picture. But my point is that what Jesus shows us is a correct interpretation of the world. That's the difference. And he shows us how to live in it. Many forms of religion talk about religious rites, contemplation, and trying to be good. Atheism, at its best, talks of appreciating nature and striving to be good. Christian faith talks about free gift and the response of love. All of these are worthy, but only one is getting to the heart of the matter correctly. Okay, a little bit more then. Another point about the limits of science is related to the point I just made. It's simply that science cannot on its own resolve moral and ethical dilemmas. So here's a few. Should Britain sell arms to Middle Eastern countries? Should we pay people for donating blood? Should there be a minimal tariff for murder? And if so, what should it be? So I think we will quickly agree that actually the sort of analysis which science can undertake of unpicking things and seeing the connections between things doesn't in the end resolve dilemmas. But if you're a philosopher who tries to really understand why that isn't, it's a little bit subtle. I think the reason is that dilemmas involve an attempt to place a value on human life. But that value just can't be wrestled down into a statistic or into an abstraction. It just isn't possible to say that one person's life is more valuable than another's. You just can't say that to anyone. We can only do our best to be fair and invite each other to accept voluntarily the unfairness which we cannot avoid. Seamus Heaney said in one of his poems a line which I think is helpful. It's passive suffering makes the world go round. So science is not the meaning of life, neither can it interpret the world, nor can it even help us decide what to do when we get up tomorrow morning. That leads to my final point, illustrated by this picture. Scientific knowledge brings power, and power can be abused. So I'm now just going to draw attention to a dangerous and insidious abuse of science. This is the use of science to bolster a view of human beings, and by extension other animals, which rejects the language of love. You do hear this sometimes nowadays. It's the idea that if we want to be really clear-headed about ourselves, then we should adopt a reductionist picture in which our atoms and molecules are the main story. Concepts such as trust and love, or hate, kindness and meanness are just sort of convenient shorthands, a sort of illusion by which our brain apparatus makes an attempt to steer us around. Now, when I put it to you like this, you know it's completely wrong, but it does occasionally creep in to discussions on the radio by neuroscientists. It's sort of implied there. And it's also been claimed to follow from evolutionary biology. It's often assumed in economics and in social science. World-renowned people have announced that animals, including human animals, are no more than complicated bags manipulated by genes. And so when people hear this, they sort of begin to believe them because they think that that must be some sort of a modern or a scientific view. But my point is, it is not scientific because it is, in the end, irrational. That way of thinking of human beings upends the very idea that human beings could be rational. So it destroys the credibility of anything we say, including all of science. I'm now doing a little bit of philosophy, and I don't mind skipping it or skimming it. You won't get it the first time you hear it. It does take a bit thinking through, but the essence of it is that when you picture the human being as this sort of automaton, it amounts to saying that our behavior is not in fact steered by the reasoning process we engage in, it's steered by chemical reactions in our brain. But that claim amounts to saying all statements by human beings have no basis in reason. But if a human being just said that, then it cannot have a basis in reason by definition, right? It's a contradiction. Okay, of course this has to be presented more carefully to really show what it is about, and I haven't got time for that. But I'm just emphasizing that in fact science, rightly understood, does not unpick and throw away our deepest values, such as the priority of love over hate, or the idea that our lives have purpose. Rather, it has to assume those in order to even make a start. It does help us more fully see the wonderful physical structures through which these values find expression in the world. But it can only do that if it's placed in a context where we already affirm those values. So that's my final point. Science is a good servant, but a bad master. If we start trying to make science into an all-powerful dictator and only source of knowledge, then we will first destroy our hope and then our humanity. But if we say that, if we say that love is just a behavior pattern or merely a survival strategy, then we deceive ourselves and ultimately destroy both ourselves and science. But if we assert by faith that love is the deepest truth of the universe, then we'll come alive. By putting love first, science will follow after. Science becomes a welcome servant that gives us fulfilling insights and helps us learn how to put love into action. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'll kind of shepherd us through a question time, but I guess you might want to get more into conversation time. So we'll see how it flows, and we'll just try and manage it in some way. So perhaps would someone like to kick off and raise some response they wish to launch off with Andrew?